It's about the experience, right? We don't want to end up with 20 different animals in the zoo just in order to try to optimize for our workloads. We don't want to have animals that all are on a different caring and feeding schedule, different firmware baselines, what have you not. It drives complexity. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's always fun to start out like the CloudFest by sitting next to Jeff and talking about race cars. It's a lot more fun than talking about computers because actually, you can do stuff in those. You can break them too, which is one of the things that you're really not supposed to do with servers. But nonetheless, what we're here to talk about today is some of the things that HPE has been driving inside of the actual innovation within the box. Yesterday, you heard from my good friend and colleague, Xavier, who was here with some of the solutions that we're doing. Oh, I'm getting water too. Some of the solutions that we're doing within the AI space, and that really helps you guys to be able to focus on the innovation and the sale instead of necessarily looking at the building of the infrastructure itself. Now, that being said, there are obviously parts of the service provider industry that still continues heavily to focus on the infrastructure part, simply because that's sort of kind of like where we're coming from. Now, the way the service provider industry has gone about looking at infrastructure over the years has very much been like give me a couple of the pass downs that some of the other segments in the industry that uses IT use, and then let me adapt that to my needs. And frankly, as we would say in racing, that's a suboptimal kind of approach. The real approach to take to this is really to be able to have a series of infrastructure pieces that are specifically optimized for the use case and the workload that you're trying to address. The problem that comes with that is that you typically end up with not really like a large fleet of stuff that's very uniform, but moreover like almost like a zoo of 200 different shapes and sizes that you now have to basically go and deal with. So it ultimately becomes a trade-off between complexity on one side or sprawl. So do I want to deal with the sprawl and then therefore have an optimized experience for each and every workload? Or do I want to have less complexity in that space, but therefore also be sub-optimized in each and every one of the workloads? This has been a conundrum that we've been working through as an industry for the longest time, and one of the things that HPE takes very seriously, along with some of our esteemed colleagues, whether it's Dell, whether it's Lenovo, whether it's some of the silicon vendors like Intel and AMD, et cetera, is to go out and address some of those things. And the way we typically address these things is through standardization and standardization bodies. Sounds like it's very boring, it's very dusty, it's kind of like, oh, this is like meeting in back rooms and what have you not. And it typically is, I'm not gonna lie. But that being said, over the last 5-8 years, much of this innovation has come into much more open forums, and you will see things like OCP becoming, if not already being, one of the foremost standardization bodies. So, what did we do in that space? Well, we sat down with the aforementioned colleagues, Dell, Lenovo, AMD was in there, Intel was in there, Ampere, Sean is in there as well as several service providers, both some of the very large ones, but also in many cases, service providers just like yourself that are not necessarily hyperscalers. We sat down and we said, how can we fundamentally change this equation to make compute a configurable thing? Almost like software where I can choose which packages I want, combine those together, and then create a experience where even though that I have variations in the infrastructure that I'm deploying, the experience from an operational standpoint, meaning being able to do things at scale in a highly automated way, that I can essentially pluck these things together, almost think of it as Lego bricks that comes together, but yet still provides you a uniform experience. This is what we have reimagined with the latest generation signified with the Intel Xeon 6s that's been coming out both from us and from our colleagues in the industry. And they've all been built around this new open standard that's called DCMHS, which is spearheaded out of OCP. What it fundamentally does is that it allows us to take and break what used to be monolithic designs inside of the servers into multiple discrete functional units that we can then freely combine, take apart, and recombine without actually changing the experience from a manageability, firmware, thermal, and operational standpoint and the way that they behave in the data center. So it comes down to not just being able to achieve exactly what you want in terms of optimization for your workload, but it, in many cases, also ends up helping out with things like cost, with agility, the ability to go in and rejig what you have in the data center without having to actually go and have a large CapEx investment associated with it. So it really is a question about going from what used to be monolithics to now being composable blocks of compute that you can essentially put together. Now, you've heard us use the word composable before in HPE. We did it around our blade servers, specifically our HPE Synergy, which was also very much a modular kind of environment. The difference is that not only is this no longer a sort of kind of boutique, fairly high-end, fairly costly kind of infrastructure, but the componentry has now been broken even further down to the point where you can freely swap out things like motherboards, you can swap out CPUs, you can swap out all the different discrete components in the system and recombine them in the data center without actually having to go out and buy new equipment. What I said, as I said before, this is about, yes, cost to some extent, but it's frankly much more around creating that operational paradigm. If you think about what infrastructure costs you today, sure, there's an upfront cost in terms of here's what I pay for the system when I get it in the door. But if you actually go through and you look at your TCO analysis of what does it actually cost me to produce revenue out of this new shiny piece of hardware that I have, you very quickly realize that things like cooling, things like operational time, downtime, firmware, patching, but also all the tooling that you have to put around your infrastructure is actually what drives a very significant amount of your ongoing cost. Being able to eliminate that by right-sizing the infrastructure, by being able to do seamless deployments because your manageability of the environment at scale remains unchanged regardless of which shapes of infrastructure you have, not only helps you bring down that operational cost, but it actually helps you with the ROI on a long-term investment. Today, if we need to upgrade from one generation to the next generation, what do? We go out, we buy a new box, right? That's always the universal answer. Let me just buy another box. It's not very sustainable. It's not very good for the environment. We're chucking away a bunch of stuff that's actually really well, still very relevant. And in many cases, what you needed to upgrade was like 2 or 3 discrete things inside of the system. This is what this modularity concept allows you to do, and because it is built in an open standard across the industry, it no longer limits you to have to buy things from a single vendor. You can start combining pieces across the industry, and in many cases you will see vendors like HPE actually go out and say, you know what, we don't actually have that specific type of a component you're looking for, so we're going to go and grab it from one of our colleagues, we're going to put it into our infrastructure, we're going to bring it through our factory, we're going to put an HPE part number on it so we can actually do warranty and services and all the other things that comes with it. And hence, your experience is now vastly larger than what it was before in terms of choice. But it also allows you to thereby fine-tune, without compromising your operational cost envelope, exactly what it is you're going for. So how does that come together? Well, as I said before, Lego bricks, right? I'm Danish, even though I sound very American. I'm sorry about that, but I am actually Danish, so I have this affinity for Legos, right? I really like the way that all the things click together, and big Star Wars nerd as well, so I built some of the bigger stuff as well. But Legos, if you have ever played with them, you will recognize comes as multiple different pieces. All of them fit together. There are standardized ways by which, in the case of Legos, it's the knobs that sit up on top and you click them together. Same thing goes here. Standardized interfaces across all of the boards. They're electrically compatible. There's firmware compatibility built into it. And we thereby then take them, and where we before would have had 2 or 3 or 4 different monolithic designs. Here's a big motherboard. We put it into a steel tray, and it goes into the data center. You now have the ability to essentially vary every single part of the configuration to your liking. Every part of the infrastructure is a first-rate citizen, which means that it's not like if you choose this, you have to choose that. You can go and say, well, you know what? I want a different chassis on this. I don't want these to be in 1U pizza boxes. I would like them to be standing up on its side and be put into a sled system. Great, let's do that. Let's bend some sheet metal around that, and now you have that functional component. I would like to have a different set of drive cages. I would like to use all the excess U.2 drives I've got sitting on the shelves. Great. It may be that the servers out of the gate don't actually support that. Well, you no longer have to make that compromise. You go and you get yourself a U.2 backplane, and guess what? It clicks straight into the rest of the infrastructure. This allows you to, with a fairly small amount of subcomponentry, call them sub-assemblies, to basically have thousands of different combinatorics, and thereby have a very small spares pool, but a very large differentiation between serving your workloads right. It fundamentally comes down to 3 pillars in terms of how you put this together. It's about being tailored, which is designing in and around the workload. Sure, in the old days, we would always go, I will just buy a box, right? That box could do 10 or 20 different things. It would be sort of kind of like optimized for each of them, but because they were sort of kind of like also optimized for other things, that meant that you were paying for something that you frankly didn't really need for that specific workload. No longer have to do that. That's what the tailored piece is about. The second piece that you bring into this is the security. And the reason why security is such a key piece and key tenet in here is that now you're beginning to click together multiple different components from potentially multiple different vendors. Can you actually trust that your system is secure? This means that there is a whole different paradigm in terms of how the system is implemented from a security standpoint, and it brings a set of new innovations in both around how you ensure that you're quantum safe in terms of your management interfaces, but frankly also how you go to approach things like firmware flashing, and all those sort of things. And then last but not least, and I talked about this before, the experience. Having a unified experience across all of this, regardless of which shape you choose to implement in the data center. Now, if I click down on these, in terms of tailored, as I said, configurable, customized, and fitted. It's really a question about zooming in on what it is you're trying to provide for your customers. If you are a bare metal hoster, you will know the issues that comes with trying to stock 40 different kinds of configurations. How do I actually swap stuff back and forth when a customer comes to me and say, you know what, I'd like to have like this processor, or I'd like to have this amount of drives. And you're sitting and you're looking at your fleet and going like, do we turn that business away? Do we bring out a screwdriver and start to try to cobble it together ourselves? Do we go out and buy a new box? Well, in the case of MHS, you don't have to make that choice. You have the pieces on the shelf, and you literally click one out and click the next one in. Boot the system back up, firmware and management experience exactly the same. Don't have to change anything in your orchestration. No small peons running around on the data center floor with USB sticks to try to flash everything and get it ready. Customized is, again, a question about, do you need standard componentry? Do you need componentry from multiple vendors, and how do you bring those together? This is the trick that most of the tier 1 superscalers and hyperscalers basically deal with, is that they have multiple different designs because they're just so big. And in many cases, they'll just go out and they'll get something that's designed specifically for their thing. This is why they, in many cases, not just have an economy of scale advantage over, near superscalers, but also because they can actually drive a specific design that is private just to them. Having this sort of an approach gets you within 2 to 3% of the cost envelope of doing what the tier ones are doing, because now the entire industry comes together around a series of standardized components and subassemblies that we can freely share between each other. And then last but not least, being able to fit it. This is all standardized in a way where we can put these things into multiple different form factors. We can wrap different kinds of sheet metal around it. We can put it in Velcro if that's what we want to do. And because everything is mechanically standardized and fitted, we can essentially ensure that all the pieces go together. If we think about the trusted part of this, I touched on this before. Once you put multiple things together, it's no longer one big piece of motherboard plastic. You now have to be able to establish trust, knowing that no one in the supply chain anywhere along the way, had their fingers into the firmware code or put, extra extraneous devices in there. This whole piece is about ensuring that when you click together multiple different vendors, that you can always trust that what comes out on the other end is a secure environment that you can safely go and sell to your customers. And then last but not least, it's about the experience, right? We don't want to end up with 20 different animals in the zoo just in order to try to optimize for our workloads. We don't want to have animals that all are on a different caring and feeding schedule, different firmware baselines, what have you not. It drives complexity. It makes the orchestration really, really hard. It makes it hard to change. All that have been essentially taken away by going in and putting together a firmware and interoperability framework across the industry. That's what is at the core of DCMHS. It's flexible, it's innovative, and it's secure. It all comes down to, and you've heard me say this a couple of times, the experience. The experience in DCMHS is driven around the management paradigm. We all have to recognize that as service providers, we operate things at scale. We don't have time or money to go out and work with every single server by hand. We have to automate. This is how we scale. And in the scalability paradigm of DCMHS, all of this is centered around the central controller for the experience that drives both interoperability, firmware, manageability, and the security. And all of that comes out, and this is where differentiation actually starts happening in the industry. There are people who choose to implement their own management environments, and there are people who choose to take it off the shelf. Those who choose to take it off the shelf will get the same experience across, but with no value-added features. So, what is value-added features and why are they important? Well, is things like custom extensions to your management environment important for you? Do you need Redfish compliance? Would you like to run open source firmware? Would you like to run OpenBMC? Those are some of the things that where you as a service provider can start adding in your extra value either through orchestration, speed, innovation, or whatever your vector of investment is. And not all vendors are created equal in that space. For HPE, this is driven by our ILO technology that continues to lead the industry. For Dell, it's done through their iDRAC. And pretty much for the rest of the industry, they're all using the same stuff. And you can say, well, so is that a problem? Isn't that great with standardization? Sure. From a standardization standpoint, it's probably great. From an innovation standpoint, however, you got to question that. Why? Well, if you got 50 different vendors that are all using the same management platform, do you think any of them are actually going to innovate on that and contribute that to 49 of their competitors? Very unlikely. So this is the key piece in where the innovation of the experience is going to come in. You're going to see, and can already see in our booth today, how we are actually innovating in that space, how we can take and drastically reduce the complexity you have to deal with, even though that you have multiple different shapes and sizes. If you want to come and play with Lego bricks, not necessarily just Legos, but also actual servers that can be put together as Legos, come and take a look at what we got over in booth A5. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention.